3 years ago, I made a decision that cost me $194,000 and every Sunday for 18 months. I paid off my mother's mortgage, gutted the kitchen, rebuilt the master bath with a roll-in shower and grab bars that looked like brushed nickel towel rails, widened 3 doorways, replaced every interior threshold with flush transitions, and had a whole house generator installed so she would never spend another winter night without heat if a storm knocked the power. I did all of it in secret. And when I finally brought her home to see it, she stood in the front doorway and covered her mouth with both hands and could not speak for almost a full minute. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong by a significant margin. My name is Claire. I am 32 years old. I work as a forensic accountant, which means my entire professional life is built around the understanding that numbers do not lie, but the people presenting them often do. I know how to read a financial document the way a cardiologist reads an EKG, not just what it says but what it is hiding, what it is preparing for, where the irregularity is that everyone else walked past. I did not arrive at this work by coincidence. My mother was diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis 11 years ago when I was 21 and she was 53 and had been widowed for 4 years and was already doing everything alone. She told me on a Thursday evening over the phone in the same tone she would use to tell me the dishwasher needed a new part. She said the neurologist was optimistic, the medication was manageable, and she did not want me to rearrange my life. She said that last part 3 times in different ways, the way she always does when she is most afraid of something. I told her I heard her. Then I spent the next decade quietly rearranging my life anyway, because that is how you love someone who refuses to ask for help. You do not wait for the ask. You see the need and you move toward it without announcing yourself. The house had been in her name since my father died. A 4-bedroom colonial in the kind of suburb where everyone knows what your car says about your finances, and the HOA sends letters about gutter maintenance. She had lived there for 27 years. My brother, who is 4 years older than me and has always had a talent for making himself the gravitational center of any conversation without contributing much of the actual substance to it, had moved out at 22 and visited at holidays and called on birthdays with the confidence of someone who believed that effort was defined by intention rather than action. His wife Renata was pleasant in the way that surfaces are pleasant before you look underneath them. The mortgage had 14 years left on it. My mother's MS had been progressing slowly but consistently for 3 years, and her neurologist had introduced the word secondary progressive into their conversations in a way that meant the relapsing remitting phase was transitioning into something with less recovery between episodes. She was still working part-time, she was still driving short distances. But I had watched her on the phone one afternoon trying to open a child-proof medicine cap while her hands were in a flare period, and I had understood in a very concrete and non-negotiable way that the house needed to be different before she needed it to be different before she needed it to be. I hired a contractor I'd worked with professionally on an estate liquidation case, someone I trusted not because I liked him, but because I had seen his documentation practices and they were meticulous. I pulled the permits under my name as the project owner. I told my mother I was doing some updates as a birthday gift and let her believe I meant a new backsplash and maybe a coat of paint. The full scope was something I kept to myself for 18 months. Wide doorways throughout the main floor. A master bath rebuilt from the studs out, 0 threshold shower, fold-down bench, handheld fixture, bars that blended with the design rather than announcing themselves as medical equipment. Kitchen counters at 2 heights so she could work standing or seated without feeling like she was in a clinical setting. Better lighting in every hallway. A ramp that integrated into the porch structure so cleanly that it looks like a design choice rather than an accommodation. New HVAC, new electrical panel, full house generator on a pad in the side yard. I paid off the remaining mortgage balance in a lump sum on a Tuesday morning in February. I remember because it was snowing and I was in my car in the parking garage outside my office. And I transferred the funds from my personal investment account and sat for a moment with my hands in my lap thinking about my father and about the way my mother had looked that Thursday evening on the phone 11 years ago, trying so hard to sound unafraid. I put the deed into a life estate. My mother holds full rights of use and occupancy for the remainder of her lifetime. I am named as the remainder beneficiary, which means the property passes to me upon her death without going through probate, and which means no one, no creditor, no family member, no well-meaning stranger, can force a sale or transfer during her lifetime without her written consent. I had a real estate attorney I trusted from a professional referral review the structure twice before I filed it. She told me it was clean, properly recorded with the county, and not subject to challenge by anyone outside the life estate. I brought my mother home on a Saturday afternoon in early April. I told her we were going to lunch and then stopping by the house so I could check on a contractor detail. We pulled into the driveway and I watched her look at the porch, and then look at me, and then look at the porch again. It took her longer than usual to get out of the car that day, because her left side had been giving her trouble that week. I walked around and stood beside her and she took my arm and we went up the ramp together, and I opened the front door and I showed her what the last 18 months had looked like from the inside. She stood in the kitchen and ran her hand along the lower counter section and looked at the clearance beneath it, where a wheelchair could pull up flush if it ever came to that. And she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I thought I was going to have to leave this house. I thought I was going to have to let it go before I was ready." I told her the mortgage was gone. I told her the deed had her name on it as long as she wanted it. I told her nobody could make her leave and nobody could change how it was used without her permission. She looked at me the way she looked at me the morning I graduated college, which is the only way I know how to describe it. We spent that first weekend going through every room. She opened every cabinet. She tested the shower bench. She stood at the kitchen window in the morning with her coffee and watched the yard the way she used to before the diagnosis. When standing at that window was something she did because she wanted to and not because she was calculating how long she could stay upright before the fatigue pulled her down. I drove back to my apartment on Sunday evening feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Something settled. Something that had been suspended in uncertainty for years that had finally been placed down on solid ground. I should have anticipated what came next. I know my brother well enough to have anticipated it. I chose not to because I wanted to believe the situation was simple. It was not. My mother mentioned the renovations to my brother during their weekly phone call 9 days after I showed her the house. She was happy. She was grateful. She told him about the shower and the counters and the generator and the mortgage being gone, and I understood later that she told him all of it because she could not hold that much happiness inside herself without it spilling over into the nearest available ear. That is simply who she is. I do not hold it against her. My brother called me the following evening. He said it sounded incredible, that I had done an amazing thing, that he was proud of me. He asked a few questions that I registered at the time as curiosity and understand now as reconnaissance. He asked what the total cost had been. He asked whether I had gotten anything in writing from her. He asked whether I had talked to an estate attorney. I answered the first two and deflected the third and told myself I was being uncharitable. I was not being uncharitable. I was being accurate and choosing not to act on it. 3 weeks later, my mother called me on a Thursday morning while I was in a client meeting. I stepped out when I saw her name because she does not call during work hours unless something has shifted. Her voice was doing the thing it does when she is managing two feelings that are pulling in opposite directions. She said my brother had mentioned coming to visit that weekend. Him and Renata and the kids, just to see the house and have dinner. She paused. She said he had also mentioned something about talking through some ideas while they were there. She paused again. She said she wanted me to be there. That pause told me what I needed to know. I rearranged my Friday afternoon and drove up that evening. When I arrived, my mother was in the living room with a cup of tea and an expression I recognized. She was holding herself very carefully, the way she does when she is trying not to let her body betray what her mind is doing. She told me my brother had asked, during their phone call, whether she had ever thought about the long-term cost of maintaining the house alone, whether she had considered what the house could generate if it were used differently, whether she had thought about what a sale might look like and what her share would come to. I asked her what she had told him. She said she had told him she was happy where she was. She said he had told her that was great, that nobody wanted to pressure her, that they just wanted to make sure she had all the information. She said it in a way that told me she had found the conversation unsettling and was still trying to talk herself out of that feeling. I stayed for dinner. My brother arrived the next morning with Renata and their 2 kids and 4 bags of groceries, which is the kind of gesture that announces itself as generosity while also announcing an intention to stay a while. He hugged my mother for a long time. He told her the house looked incredible. He told me I had done something extraordinary. He said it all with complete apparent sincerity, and I sat across the kitchen table from him and drank my coffee and said very little. Renata walked the house with a measuring tape during the first hour. She said she was thinking about furniture arrangement. I watched her pause in the master bedroom doorway and look at the width and take a photograph of the hallway. After lunch, my brother sat down at the kitchen table with a printed document. He placed it in front of my mother with the careful movement of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. He told her a friend of his who worked in real estate had run some quick numbers. He told her the neighborhood had appreciated significantly in the last 3 years. He turned the document toward her and showed her a number in the middle of the page. He said, "Mom, this is what the house is worth right now. You could take this, put it in a managed account, move somewhere smaller and easier to maintain, and never worry about a utility bill or a repair cost again." He paused. He said, "Claire already has her career and her apartment. This money could actually change your day-to-day life." My mother looked at the number. Then she looked at me. I looked at my brother. I said, "Can I see that?" He slid it across the table with the ease of someone who had expected the question. It was a comparative market analysis printed on a real estate agency letterhead. The agent's name and direct line were printed at the bottom. Someone had already had this conversation with a professional and received a document in return before sitting down at this table. I set it down. I said, "I need to get something for my car." I had brought my work back the way I always do, the way my colleagues have learned to expect, and the way people who are planning something tend to underestimate. I have a habit that developed during my first year in forensic accounting. When I watched a business partner walk into a mediation with a beautiful story and no documentation and lose everything that could have been protected simply because the paperwork was not in the room, I stopped letting paperwork be somewhere else after that. I came back to the table and set my bag down and unzipped it and removed a folder. I placed the first document in front of my brother. It was the recorded life estate deed, stamped by the county recorder's office with the filing date and instrument number. I pointed to my mother's name in the grantor section and her name again as the life tenant. I explained what a life estate meant in plain language. I said, as long as she is living, this property cannot be sold, transferred, mortgaged, or materially altered without her written consent. Her interest is not a percentage. It is the whole property for the duration of her life. There is nothing to split. Renata said, quietly, from the other side of the table, "But you're the remainder beneficiary. Meaning you benefit when she dies." I said yes. I said that was correct. I said the life estate structure was chosen specifically because it allowed my mother to hold complete control of her home during her lifetime while ensuring the property did not go through probate at her death. I said it had nothing to do with my financial interest and everything to do with the fact that a clear title structure makes it harder for third parties to create competing claims. I did not say that last sentence while looking at my brother. I did not need to. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He said nobody's trying to create a claim. He said this was a family conversation about options. He said I was making it adversarial. He said the word adversarial the way people say it when they mean that the other person has introduced facts they were not prepared for. I placed the second document on the table. It was a letter from the real estate attorney confirming the validity of the life estate structure, the recorded status with the county, and a specific paragraph noting that life tenants retain full rights of occupancy and cannot be compelled to sell or vacate by remainder beneficiaries or other family members regardless of the property's assessed value. My brother looked at it for a moment. He said, "Estate structures can always be revisited." I said, "This one was designed specifically so that it could not be revisited by anyone other than the life tenant herself." I looked at my mother. I said, "If you ever decide you want to sell or move or change anything, that decision belongs entirely to you. No one else at this table has a role in it." She nodded once. She put her hand flat on the table. I placed a third document in front of my brother. It was the mortgage payoff confirmation from the lender, dated 14 months prior, showing a zero balance. I placed the fourth document beside it. A project summary from my contractor with line item costs totaling $194,000 and change, attached to a copy of every permit I had pulled, signed off by the county building department. I said, the money that paid for this house and everything in it came entirely from me. There is no shared investment to discuss. There is no asset to divide. There is a home that belongs to the woman sitting at this table, and the only person in this room with any legal relationship to that home is her. The kitchen was quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. My brother said, after a moment, that this was not how families were supposed to work. He said I had made a unilateral decision that affected all of them. He said it in the tone people use when they mean that the person who did all the work should have asked permission before doing it. I said that the only person whose input was required for a decision about our mother's home was our mother. I said it without raising my voice. I said it the way I say things in a deposition room, without heat, without apology. Renata gathered the kids from the living room. My brother folded the CMA and put it in his jacket pocket. He told my mother he loved her. He told her to think about what was best for herself, not what other people had decided for her. And I watched my mother's face absorb that sentence and file it somewhere. He looked at me from the doorway and said we would talk later. I told him I looked forward to it. Both cars were gone by 3 in the afternoon. My mother made tea. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time while the light changed in the yard and the afternoon came in through the west-facing window the way it does in late spring, long and flat and gold. She said, after a while, that Renata had asked her, during the house walkthrough that morning, whether she had ever thought about what it would be like to live somewhere smaller. She said Renata had mentioned a very nice independent living community about 40 minutes away. She said Renata had shown her photographs on her phone. I did not say anything for a moment. My mother said, I knew something was wrong when she had the photographs already loaded. I said, yes. She said, I didn't know how to tell them that I wasn't interested without starting something. I said, you don't have to be the one to start or stop anything. That's what the paperwork is for. She smiled in the way she smiles when something is both sad and clarifying at the same time. 4 days later, I received a text from my brother with a link to an article about life estates and their limitations in estate planning. The text said, just want to make sure you considered all the angles. I read the article, which raised valid points about tax implications that did not apply to our situation, and said nothing substantive about the protections I had specifically structured to address. I did not reply. 6 days after that, my mother called me in the early afternoon. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. She said a woman had come to the front door that morning, a real estate agent, and told her she had been referred by a colleague who thought my mother might be interested in discussing her options. She said the agent had been perfectly pleasant and had left a card. She said the card had my brother's friend's agency name printed on it. The same agency name that had appeared at the bottom of the CMA my brother had placed on the kitchen table 10 days earlier. I was in my car within 40 minutes. I had installed a video doorbell during the renovation. One of the details I had added without fanfare. The kind of thing that looks like a standard smart home feature and functions, among other things, as a documentation system. I pulled up the footage on my phone while I was still on the highway. The agent had arrived at 11:14 and left at 11:27. She had taken a photograph of the exterior from the driveway before leaving. When I arrived, my mother was in the kitchen. I sat across from her and opened my laptop and pulled up the State Real Estate Commission's license lookup and found the agent. Then I pulled up the agency's website and found the colleague my brother had originally referenced. Then I drafted an email to the agency's managing broker noting that an agent affiliated with their office had appeared at a private residential address and solicited a homeowner who had not initiated contact and was not represented as a potential seller. That the property was held in a recorded life estate which was searchable in the county records and which the agent could have reviewed before making contact, and that any further unsolicited contact with the homeowner would be reported to the State Real Estate Commission as a potential violation of solicitation rules governing life estate properties. I copied my attorney on the email. I sent it at 4:47. I also drafted a letter to my brother and sent it through my attorney's office rather than from my personal email. It noted that direct or third-party contact with the life tenant for the purpose of soliciting a property transaction, influencing a property decision, or gathering information about the property for commercial use constituted interference with the life estate and would be treated accordingly. It noted that all future communications about the property should be directed to my attorney rather than to my mother directly. My mother read the letter over my shoulder. She said, "Is that necessary?" I said, "Yes. Not because I think he'll push further, but because now he knows that if he does, there is a process waiting for him that has nothing to do with whether we stay on speaking terms." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father used to say that clear fences make better neighbors. He meant it about the people next door, but I think he was right about a lot of things." I stayed for the weekend. On Saturday morning, my mother sat at the lower kitchen counter on a stool and made biscuits from scratch, which she had not done since before the diagnosis because the old counter height had made it difficult on bad arm days. She worked slowly and with complete attention and did not ask for help and did not need any. I sat at the table behind her with my coffee and the morning paper and said nothing, because the only thing that moment needed was to continue undisturbed. My brother did not reply to the attorney's letter directly. 3 weeks later, he left a voicemail for my mother that was warm and brief and made no mention of real estate or market values or independent living communities. My mother called me after she listened to it and told me what it said. She said she was going to call him back. I told her that was exactly the right thing to do. I told her that nothing about the paperwork and nothing about the letters was meant to change her relationship with him. It was meant to change what he could do to her home without her permission. Those are different things and they operate on different tracks. He and Renata have not visited since. My mother says she thinks they are embarrassed. I think that is probably part of it and resentment is probably another part. And I have made my peace with both. What I understand now, having spent years inside the financial structures people build to protect the things they care about, is that documentation is not aggression. It is not a declaration of war. It is a description of reality placed in writing, so that the reality does not depend on anyone's memory of what was said at a kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon. My brother had walked into that kitchen with a story about generosity and family and options, and had expected that story to be the only document in the room. He had not expected me to open a folder. There is something specific about caring for someone that the people watching from the outside tend to misread. They see the money and the time and the decisions made on behalf of another person, and they interpret it as control. They say that generosity without consultation is a form of power. What they mean, usually, is that they were not consulted and they believe they should have been. What they do not say is that they were not present for the 11 years of phone calls and medication schedules and neurologist appointments, and the Tuesday afternoon I sat in a hospital waiting room while my mother waited to hear whether a new lesion was in a location that mattered more than the last one. Presence confers standing. That is not a legal principle. It is just true. I drove out last month on a Sunday with no particular plan. My mother was on the back porch when I arrived, sitting in the low armchair I had positioned to catch the afternoon sun in the spot where her garden used to be before the maintenance became too much. She was reading. She had a cup of something on the small table beside her and the generator was running a test cycle and humming quietly at the side of the house, and the afternoon was the particular kind of still that early autumn produces in that part of the state when the light is long and the temperature is exactly right. She looked up when she heard my car and said, "I didn't know you were coming." I said I wasn't sure either until about 2 hours ago. She made room on the porch the way she does, pointing at the second chair that lives just inside the back door for exactly this kind of afternoon, and I brought it out and sat beside her and we talked about nothing much for an hour. She told me her neurologist was cautiously pleased with her last MRI. She told me her neighbor had stopped by with tomatoes from his garden. She told me she had finally rearranged the hall closet the way she had always wanted to, and that it had taken her 4 days and felt completely worth it. After a while, she put her book down and looked at the yard and said, "I used to be afraid that needing things was the same as becoming a burden. I used to make myself smaller than I needed to be because I thought that was the cost of staying welcome." She paused. She said, I didn't know you could need things and still be fully the person you were, that those weren't in opposition. I told her they never were. She said, I know that now. The light moved across the yard the way it does out there in the fall, slow and without urgency, the way time moves when it is not being threatened by anything. My mother picked her book back up. I stayed until the sun was gone and the generator light blinked green on its cycle, and the kitchen window was lit from inside, like something that had always been there and was simply, finally, being used the right way. Have you ever spent years of your life quietly building something for someone you love, not because you wanted credit, but because you could see clearly what they needed and you were in a position to provide it, and then had someone walk into that thing you built and begin measuring it for their own purposes? If you have, you already know that the choice is not between protecting it and being kind. The choice is between letting someone dismantle it with a smile on their face and making clear, calmly and with documentation, that the smile does not change what the structure is or who it belongs to. Kindness that cannot hold its ground is not kindness. It is just hope. And hope without a recorded deed is a very fragile thing to build a life on.